I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
The announcement arrived without ceremony, without warning, and without a single comforting phrase from the crown. Inside the ancient and heavy walls of Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla sat completely frozen as a senior courtier read the final royal decree aloud. Her world shattered in a matter of seconds. Her title as queen had been officially withdrawn, her position beside the crown had formally ended, and every single royal financial privilege connected to her adult relatives was being terminated with immediate effect. When the courtier finished reading, the entire room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Camilla slowly lowered her head, covered her face with her trembling hands, and began to cry bitter tears. She did not move as the palace secretary reached the final paragraph of the document. She gripped the arm of her velvet chair tightly, her knuckles turning white, and whispered in a broken voice that they had taken everything from her. This binding royal announcement was not a mere suggestion or a proposal awaiting further debate. It was a formal palace order that took effect across the entire royal household immediately. The decree declared that she would no longer hold or use the title of queen, reducing her status to a courtesy designation without any constitutional authority, ceremonial precedence, or an independent operating office. King Charles stared deeply at the pages on his desk, but he could not bring himself to meet his wife's eyes. The king knew that this dramatic decision did much more than just change a name on a piece of paper. It publicly ended transport support, household staffing, security allowances, accommodation, and ceremonial expenses connected to Camilla's adult relatives. Any future financial help for her family would have to come directly from Camilla's private funds, not from the royal finances. The king's absolute silence told her everything she needed to know. He had known this storm was coming, and he had chosen not to stop it. Camilla turned toward the courtier, her eyes red and filled with tears, and asked whether the order could be appealed. The courtier shook his head solemnly and replied that the decree had already been approved, entered into the official royal record, and distributed to every single department responsible for royal duties, security, and financial access. In plain terms, a decree is a final command issued under absolute royal authority. The harsh consequences began even before she could leave the room. Her royal cipher, the official symbol used on her letters, property, and household material, was ordered to be removed immediately. Her separate office was suspended. Her security arrangements were placed under an urgent review, and every single public engagement scheduled under her title was canceled or reassigned. A sharp metallic scrape cut through the quiet corridor outside as an aide lifted the gold nameplate from outside her private office. No speech could have made the loss clearer to her. The title had disappeared from the door before she even found the strength to stand up. King Charles finally broke the heavy silence, explaining that public anger alone had not caused this tragedy. Prince William had strongly supported a family decision after a massive breach of trust forced the crown to act. But before Camilla could fully understand why her life was being dismantled, she had to face the truth that every person in that palace had something deeply personal to lose. This was not simply a battle over a historic royal title. It was a direct confrontation between a husband carrying the crushing weight of the crown, a son determined to protect the future of the monarchy at all costs, and a woman who had spent decades fighting for public acceptance. Charles feared losing the peace of his marriage. William feared inheriting a damaged and untrusted institution, and Camilla feared something far more personal, that history would remember her not as a true queen, but as a temporary mistake that the palace finally corrected. She had spent years carefully building the position that was now slipping away from her. Every public appearance, her extensive charitable work, and careful image management had slowly turned public rejection into acceptance. The title of queen had become more than just a name to her. It was the ultimate proof that she had survived every historic scandal, every bitter whisper, and every painful comparison that followed her into royal life. However, Prince William saw that exact same title very differently. As the official heir to the throne, he believed the monarchy had to outlive private loyalties and family pressures. The prince feared that blurred lines around money, access, and influence would become an unbearable burden on his future reign. He simply could not allow personal relationships to create permanent financial claims against the crown. Charles sat completely alone after Camilla stormed out of the room. The king ran his fingers across the signature line of the final order and felt the full cruelty of what he had approved. Protecting the ancient institution had required him to diminish the very woman he once promised to defend. He had chosen duty over love, but duty offered him no comfort. Camilla felt absolutely no sympathy for his difficult position. She deeply believed that William had engineered her removal from power, and that Charles had surrendered without fighting hard enough for her. To her, the announcement was not about financial discipline. It was a final, cold rejection of a woman who had spent her entire life trying to prove she belonged. Princess Catherine had remained completely silent in public, yet she had thoroughly reviewed the proposed changes with William in private. The princess was not driven by revenge. She simply feared that private family access was becoming dangerously confused with official royal entitlement. The latest financial review made that fear impossible to ignore, as members of Camilla's extended family had benefited indirectly from royal vehicles, protective residences, staff support, and logistical assistance. None of those arrangements had been designed to become lifelong privileges, yet some had begun to look permanent. William stopped outside the meeting room with Catherine. Beside him, she looked at him and asked whether he was absolutely certain about this path. William adjusted his cuffs, drew a slow breath, and answered that if he hesitated now, his own reign would begin with the exact same weakness. Camilla sat alone in her private room, remembering where this crisis had truly begun. It started with one forgotten royal ceremony, one private demand, and one moment when William's expression changed completely, forcing Charles to understand that her family's expectations had crossed a very dangerous line. That ceremony had lasted less than an hour, but the conversation afterward would become the point of no return for the entire British monarchy. Months before the palace officially removed Camilla's title, a seemingly ordinary royal ceremony at Windsor Castle exposed a massive conflict that could no longer be hidden from the family. The guests inside the grand hall saw only warm smiles, formal greetings, and carefully controlled public appearances that showed no signs of inner turmoil. However, behind a tightly closed heavy wooden door immediately after the event ended, Camilla strongly demanded permanent royal protection, official accommodation, and publicly funded lifetime support for members of her own family after Charles's reign eventually ended. Prince William firmly refused her demands on the spot. King Charles heard every single word of that intense argument, and from that exact moment forward, the critical question inside the family was no longer whether a devastating crisis would come, but rather when it would finally explode. Camilla had waited until the prestigious Windsor investiture ceremony had fully ended before making her calculated move. Once the final external guests had departed the grounds, she quietly asked William and Charles to join her in the historic King's Library, explicitly insisting that every senior aide and secretary remain outside the room. The initial request sounded completely private, but the heavy demand waiting inside was anything but simple. Camilla placed a detailed, proposed family arrangement directly before them on the table. She wanted continued high-level security coordination, official royal transport access, permanent household assistance, and protected luxury accommodation for selected relatives if Charles died or no longer ruled the country. To her, the strategic plan offered much-needed stability for her bloodline, and without it, she deeply feared her family would be brutally cast aside the moment her own position weakened. Prince William read the proposal only once and placed it back on the table with an expression of complete disapproval. The prince told her directly that marriage to the king could not create a hereditary financial entitlement for people who held no official royal duties or public responsibilities. His voice remained incredibly calm throughout the confrontation, and that absolute restraint made the cold refusal feel even more devastating to her. Camilla turned toward Charles, her voice rising as she asked him to overrule his son's harsh decision. The king opened his mouth, paused for a long moment, and said nothing at all. She stared at him in utter disbelief, waiting for the passionate defense he had offered so many times before in their long history. But none came. In that heavy silence, she finally understood that her husband would not promise the future she wanted. Camilla pushed her chair backward sharply, staring at both men. She told William that he was speaking as though she were already gone from the palace. William held her gaze without blinking and answered firmly that he was speaking about what belonged to the crown and what did not. Days later, palace finance officers discovered something far more serious that escalated the conflict. Preliminary security and accommodation assessments had already been requested in the names of Camilla's relatives before any formal approval existed. Those unauthorized requests made private hopes look like settled royal policy. William responded immediately by ordering a strictly confidential audit, a private financial review examining household privileges, transport use, event costs, staffing arrangements, and future commitments. The completed findings soon reached Charles, and one specific entry left the king visibly shaken. Camilla's separate office had actively attempted to secure future privileges using his absolute authority without his final consent. When Charles finally confronted her with that discovery, the argument was no longer about royal money. It was about whether trust inside their marriage had already collapsed completely. The door closed, the loyal aides withdrew, and 3 members of the royal family were left entirely alone with a heavy decision none of them could escape. Camilla faced Charles across the tense room, while William stood beside the stone fireplace, holding the definitive audit that had changed everything. What began as a demand for a simple explanation quickly became an intense accusation of betrayal. Voices rose, old resentments returned to the surface, and when Charles finally spoke, his words ended the argument with finality Camilla had never expected from him. Charles had summoned them after the final evening engagement and ordered every secretary, advisor, and household official to remain far outside. The king wanted no witness and no interruption for this painful moment. William opened the audit, a confidential review of money, access, staffing, and future royal benefits, and explained that several arrangements had been explored as though approval were already guaranteed. William listed the shocking findings one by one, including residential access, security coordination, ceremonial invitations, transport support, and staff assistance. Each benefit had been connected to members of Camilla's family, despite none of them holding permanent royal duties. The prince told her the danger was not only financial. Once private expectations were treated as royal promises, the next reign would inherit obligations it had never accepted. Camilla stared at him and rejected every word, saying the review had never been about rules, but about removing her from the family. She accused William of waiting years for a chance to push her aside and place his mother's memory back at the heart of the monarchy. The old wound entered the room, and the argument changed instantly. Charles stepped forward before his son could answer, his voice shaking with emotion, but his meaning remaining absolute. The king told his wife that invoking Diana would not erase the unauthorized requests or excuse the use of royal authority to protect private fears. He said the crown could not become a financial shield for one family simply because that family was close to the throne. Camilla warned them that stripping her title would expose every division they had tried to hide from the public. She threatened to speak out through a recorded personal statement and reveal how bitter the family had become. William answered that public embarrassment was less dangerous than allowing disputed privileges to continue unchecked. Camilla turned back to Charles and demanded the truth, believing William had written the punishment and forced him to accept it. The monarch finally admitted otherwise, stating he had personally authorized the palace to prepare the sanction after discovering that his name had been used to advance arrangements he had never approved. Camilla removed a ring from her finger and placed it sharply on the table, asking Charles if he was her husband or her judge. Charles stared at the ring and replied that tonight he had to be the king. Camilla had officially lost the intense argument inside the private library, but beyond that locked wooden door, the full machinery of royal power was already moving ruthlessly against her. Royal power rarely announces itself with loud shouting or public drama. It moves silently through official signatures, sealed instructions, revised household lists, and quiet conversations between influential people whose names the general public may never know. Camilla strongly believed that Charles could still reverse the harsh punishment if his deep personal emotions overcame his institutional judgment. But the decision had already passed far beyond the boundaries of one marriage. Legal advisors, financial officers, and senior members of the royal family had created a highly restrictive legal structure that even the king himself could not casually dismantle without severely threatening the crown's ultimate credibility. Charles still desperately searched for a way out of the crisis, asking his top advisors whether Camilla could keep the title of queen in private while completely giving up the staff, official precedence, and royal money attached to it. His advisors warned him firmly that such a half measure would only confuse the public, weaken enforcement, and allow the exact same financial expectations to continue under another name. Camilla's marriage to Charles remained legally untouched, but her formal royal position did not survive the purge. The palace strictly separated personal status from official power, meaning she could remain his wife while losing the office, household staffing, ceremonial rank, and public resources that came with being queen. Royal finances made the line even harder to cross, as the sovereign's household supports official duties. Duchy arrangements provide income tied strictly to royal estates, and private funds belong personally to members of the family. Camilla's relatives had absolutely no automatic right to support from any of these streams, because proximity to the monarch did not create a permanent entitlement. Princess met Charles completely alone and refused to soften the harsh truth. Princess saw the deep grief in her brother's face, but she told him plainly that further delay would only deepen the institutional damage. The trusted royal warned that every single day of uncertainty made the institution look weaker and Camilla's family demands look more powerful. Princess Catherine offered a different kind of strength during a family crisis, urging William to protect Camilla's basic dignity, even while completely ending her official authority. The princess supported allowing private accommodation and reasonable personal security, but she stood firmly against any independent royal office or continuing financial privileges for the wider family. William agreed completely because compassion could not be allowed to become a total surrender. The official announcement carried another hidden consequence, as a second order created a permanent rule stating that no spouse's extended family could receive continuing royal privileges without written approval from both the sovereign and the heir. Charles held the pen above the authorization line, his hand trembling, while Anne stood nearby and said nothing. The king finally signed the document, placed the pen down slowly, and closed his eyes as though the movement had taken the last bit of his strength. Within hours, Camilla's household received official cancellation notices, revised access instructions, and orders separating her private life from the crown. The signature took only a moment, but by morning, Camilla would discover how completely her life had changed. She did not fully understand the meaning of the announcement until the next morning, when her calendar was cleared. Her official car was no longer waiting, and staff members who once entered without knocking now stood uncertainly in the corridor. Calls from her relatives went completely unanswered because she did not know what to tell them. The title had vanished in a single public sentence, but the true punishment arrived through dozens of small absences she could no longer ignore. Camilla entered the morning room expecting the usual briefing, but only her longtime dresser and one private secretary remained. The central royal household had already reassigned several employees, and their empty places mattered deeply because those people had shaped her public life. The cancellations came incredibly quickly, suspending charities, military affiliations, and ceremonial appearances connected to her former title, while the palace decided who would inherit those responsibilities. Losing those honorary links meant losing the public purpose that had helped Camilla earn acceptance. Her family felt the change just as sharply as vehicle permissions. Palace guest arrangements, event invitations, and household services were withdrawn or returned for private payment. One relative called asking whether the promised housing protection still existed, and Camilla struggled to answer before admitting that the crown would no longer fund them. Officials then began separating her personal letters from crown records belonging to the monarchy, and Camilla feared those files might reveal how hard she had pushed to protect her relatives. Charles made the silence worse by temporarily moving his working arrangements to another residence wing to prevent more conflict. The distance between their offices had officially become the distance inside their marriage. Camilla walked toward the palace entrance at the usual hour and stopped dead when no official vehicle waited outside, as a junior aide explained that royal transport now required private payment. Evening brought an unexpected visitor when Catherine entered Camilla's private sitting room alone, without William or any official papers. For the first time since the announcement, Camilla spoke with someone who had not come to accuse or command her. For several moments, neither woman spoke, as one had lost a title she spent years trying to earn, while the other knew she would inherit responsibilities shaped by that loss. What followed was an honest conversation about fear, family, and the heavy cost of clinging to power. Catherine broke the silence, saying she had come as a member of the family, because every headline would try to define Camilla before she could define herself. Camilla listened quietly, knowing her future would be smaller but not completely erased. Camilla finally admitted that her demands were born from fear, believing her family would be abandoned the moment her title disappeared. Catherine answered gently that fear could explain the request, but it could not justify turning temporary access into permanent entitlement. Camilla then revealed that advisors outside the palace had urged her to fight by releasing private correspondence and portraying William as a punishing son, a plan that promised revenge but also guaranteed total destruction. Catherine offered another path, suggesting Camilla issue a personal statement, accepting the settlement, and protecting what remained of her dignity. Camilla reached for the ring she had left behind during the earlier confrontation and closed it inside her hand, saying after a long silence that she would not tear down what she once begged to enter. By exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, palace gates opened, broadcast alerts sounded, and the official announcement spread across Britain within seconds. The words were formal, declaring that Camilla was no longer queen, her household authority had ended, and no member of her wider family would retain automatic access to royal financial support. The country watched an institution publicly separate marriage, monarchy, and money with absolute finality. The palace framed the decision as protection for constitutional clarity, making sure everyone understood who held authority and which benefits attached to public service rather than private family connections. Camilla answered through a written personal statement accepting the order, confirming her relatives would make their own arrangements, and asking the public to respect Charles during a deeply painful transition. Supporters saw humiliation, while other voices demanded accountability, arguing that marriage to the sovereign could not create permanent financial privilege for an extended family. William became the center of the debate as the future king reshaping the monarchy, while Charles attended his next scheduled audience completely alone. The empty chair beside the king carried more weight than any speech, turning a private marriage crisis into a national symbol. That evening, Charles called Camilla, William, Catherine, and together for one final meeting behind palace walls. The final meeting did not restore her title, but the family made one last choice about what would survive. Charles remained her husband. William remained the guardian of the next reign. Catherine offered dignity, and Camilla, stripped of the name she fought decades to hold, finally accepted that the crown could never belong to her family. Camilla removed the queen's insignia from her jacket, placed it gently on the table, and simply said to let it return to the crown. Charles covered her hand with his, and left first satisfied the institution had survived, and William and Catherine departed together, leaving Charles beside Camilla facing what was left. The crown did not reject her as a person. It simply rejected the belief that love, marriage, or family connection could ever become ownership of royal power.